This presentation is going to go over a few different lessons, all of which are on the nervous system. The main objective of these presentations is by the end of it you should be able to explain how impulses travel through the body and how we respond to stimuli, which is changes in the environment. Take a moment to have a look over the key words and the learning objectives. So, within the body there are many different systems, and these systems consist of specialized cells. For example, the muscular system contains muscle cells, the skeletal system contains bones which are held together by osteocytes, the circulatory system consists of specialized cells in blood vessels, for example muscular cells, and in the nervous system there are mainly nerve cells. So the first objective was to label a nerve cell. So this is a single nerve cell. At the very start there are these branched out areas called dendrites. Inside of the cell body is a nucleus. The cell body leads along the axon, and the axon is surrounded by a fatty insulated layer called a myelin sheath, and at the end are the axon endings. I've added to this diagram receptors, which are basically globular proteins which detect changes at the end of the dendrites. These receptors can detect changes which are chemical or sensory changes. Before I talk a bit more about receptors, let's think about the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is a bit like the rubber insulator you'd find around a wire. In this case, the insulator stops the electrical charge from escaping from the wire, and this allows the current to flow more quickly. Now, the myelin sheath is quite like this. The wider the myelin sheath is, the more that the nerve cell, the axon in particular, is insulated, and this allows the electrical impulse to travel more quickly. So at the end of dendrites we find receptors, and receptors detect changes which are either chemical or sensory, and when they are stimulated they send an electrical impulse along the axon to the axon endings, which then fire out a chemical called a neurotransmitter. There are different types of receptors. Some of them are sensory receptors, and they'll detect information such as light, sound, and touch. So for example, we're talking about the receptors at the end of the optic nerve in the eye or the auditory nerves in the ear. Receptors can also be stimulated by chemicals. For example, our bodies make neurotransmitters, they also make hormones, and these kinds of chemicals can often stimulate different types of nerves. Also, we can synthesize man-made chemicals, so when people are being treated with drugs, very often these drugs mimic the effects of neurotransmitters, so they have an effect on the nervous system. Here we have a simple diagram of neurotransmission. Here are the neurotransmitters, a chemical which is fired. So they're fired through these gates at the axon ending, and the neurotransmitters are going to stimulate receptors found on a dendrite of the next nerve cell. And the neurotransmitter moves across a gap which is called a synapse. So the gap between an axon and a dendrite is called a synapse, and neurotransmitters fire across these gaps and stimulate receptors, which then cause an impulse to travel along the next nerve. Now, every type of nerve cell, or groups of nerves called neurons, are not stimulated by neurotransmitters. Earlier I was talking about how some of them were stimulated by sensory information. So for example, the optic nerve and the auditory nerve are what we called sensory neurons, and they're stimulated by information such as light and sound. We've also got motor neurons, and they are stimulated from the central nervous system, and they send a message to a muscle. So effectively what we're thinking about is a motor neuron makes muscles move, and those muscles that move, the scientific term we call them is an effector. We also find relay neurons, which are found in the spine, and they relay impulses from sensory neurons to motor neurons, and this avoids the message being sent to the brain, hence meaning that somebody is able to react to a stimuli more quickly than if they were consciously processing it. Here's a couple of pictures just to illustrate what is meant by a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. If we look at this first example A, we can see the dendrite branches here. They're stimulated by the axon ending, send a message along the axon. The axon fires a neurotransmitter which then stimulates skeletal muscle. So this means A must be a motor neuron. B, here we can see the message according to the arrows travels in this direction. So this suggests we've got the dendrites here which are being stimulated by some receptors in the skin. Notice how the cell body is in a different position here, and here are the axon endings. So this is actually sending a message from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Now there are lots of different receptors in the skin. For example, these are likely to be touch receptors, which could be to do with pressure or heat. So B is an example of a sensory neuron. This diagram looks in a little bit more detail at the kind of receptors which are found in the skin. All of these are generally touch receptors, but touch can be broken down into different kinds of receptors such as pain, heat, and pressure. Okay, let's think of an example. What happens inside you, particularly the nervous system, when you catch a ball? Well, let's try and use some of the key terminology we're talking about. So stimuli. Stimuli is the thing we are going to react to. So in this case, it's the ball. It's detected by the eye, which is a sense organ, and there are sensory neurons, particularly the optic nerves, which send a message along these neurons to the brain. From the brain, the impulse is sent down the central nervous system, so it's sent through the spine, and it's sent from the spine to muscles, and this is along a group of neurons called motor neurons. And remember, motor neurons are the kind of neurons which make the muscles move. These muscles are found in the hand, which allows the hand to move to catch the ball. So a quick recap of this. The stimuli is the ball. It's detected by a sensory organ called the eye. The eye sends messages along sensory neurons to the central nervous system, which travel along the spine and then away from the central nervous system. The impulse is carried by a motor neuron to the muscles in the hand, which allow us effectively to catch the ball. Now, not every stimuli we react to is part of a conscious process. So a lot of things we don't actually think about. This means the message is not sent to the brain through the central nervous system, rather it's relayed back to the muscles. And the reason that this happens is because it means the reaction can be quicker, and this helps people survive. Now, in the body there are lots of different examples of these kinds of reactions which aren't processed by the brain, and they are called reflex reactions, and they're basically instinctual behaviours. So for example, if you were to hit someone between the kneecap and the lower leg, their leg would involuntarily kick. If you were to stand on something sharp or touch something very hot, you wouldn't think about moving the limb that was being pricked or burnt. You would immediately move part of your body. Also, babies grip when something is put into their hands, and if an object moves towards your eyes, you can't help but blink. So I went over this a little bit on the last slide. Why is it good to react quickly to something dangerous? Well, when you react to a stimuli without thinking, it's called a reflex. This reflex is quicker, so it helps protect us from danger, and from an evolutionary sense, this means that we're more likely to survive because we're more likely to react quickly to the dangerous stimuli. So the messages don't go to the brain, instead they're sent along a sensory neuron into the spine relays along a relay neuron back to the muscles, and the muscles move more quickly. This diagram illustrates this. In this example, there is a sensory neuron which is being stimulated by pain senses. So a pin is pricked into the finger has sensory neurons which sends the message to the spinal cord. So just as it reaches the central nervous system, rather than it being sent to the brain to think about the pain, the message is relayed at this part C here, and this is called a relay neuron. The relay neuron effectively is causing a link between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, and the motor neuron then sends a message back to the muscle fibres inside of the finger, which allows the finger to move away from the pain stimuli. Okay, I don't think the nervous system is a particularly difficult topic. However, there is lots of key vocabulary, and I think this is one of the things which holds pupils back from getting really good marks. It's because they can describe what's happening, but they don't really use the key terms. So here we've got a list of the key vocabulary. On the other side are definitions. They're not matched. So if you pause the video for a few minutes and try and think, what is the definition for dendrite? What's the definition for an axon ending? So the dendrite is the part of the nerve cell at the end which has receptors. The axon ending is the end of the nerve that stores and fires chemicals called neurotransmitters. The myelin sheath is a fatty layer which insulates the axon and effectively increases the speed of the impulses. The stimuli is something that we perceive and react to. A synapse is the gap between different nerve cells. I got the animation wrong there a little bit. Sensory neurons carry impulses from sense organs to the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spine. Motor neurons carry impulses from the central nervous system to effector muscles. An effector is a muscle which is activated by a motor neuron. And a relay neuron is a neuron found in the spine, and it's important in those quick reactions called reflex arcs. So in summary, you should now be able to explain how impulses travel through nerves and around the body in response to a stimuli, including reflex arcs. Try to use, when you answer questions on the nervous system, as many of the key words as you can.